Hello, my name is Christine Cowart, and I'm going to talk about what trauma is, how it's related to correctional facilities, and how we can use that knowledge to transform correctional design for justice reform. I am a certified trauma professional and human services policy analyst with a focus on criminal justice and services to children and families. Through my career, I have worked in correctional systems and facilities in three northeastern states. Most recently, I served with the Vermont Department of Corrections before moving to the Department for Children and Families, which is responsible for administering the youth justice system in the state. I'd like to start out by talking about what trauma is and how it can impact a person. In 1998, a medical practice in California noticed that some of their patients were doing significantly better than others with seemingly similar backgrounds. They identified 10 common characteristics that, when experienced as a child, could result in poorer health outcomes. We refer to these as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short. ACEs can have lasting negative impacts throughout a person's life, including increased injury, effects on mental and maternal health, increased infections and chronic disease, and the adoption of risky health behaviors and loss of opportunities. I want to stress that this is risk, not certainty. There's a lot of things that can impact how a person is affected by adversity, including exercise, life choices, personal relationships, and therapy. But as you can see from this list, the effects of these experiences is not just psychological. Having experienced adversity can quite clearly affect a person's physical health dramatically. This data shows the prevalence of ACEs across our nation, but it's based on information collected through telephone surveys and is believed to be significantly underreported. Evidence indicates that at least 78% of the US population has experienced at least one traumatic event in their lifetimes. In addition to underreporting, the difference between these statistics is explained by recognizing that the data on this chart only includes events that happened prior to the respondent turning 18, and understanding that ACEs only represent one group of potentially traumatic events. There are disparities in the rates of adverse childhood experiences within the population. Studies routinely show that people living with a disability are more likely to have experienced ACEs than the general population. This is important to keep in mind because we know that people with disabilities are also more likely to have involvement with the criminal justice system. The results of the National Survey of Children's Health show that there are racial disparities as well. This annual nationwide survey asks parents of children under the age of 18 about ACEs experienced by their children. The results show that Black children are more likely to have higher ACE scores compared to white children, and Black children are overrepresented among children with two or more ACEs. There's also evidence that the more ACEs a person experiences, the more they're at risk for negative outcomes. This is called a dose response, and it's seen across virtually all areas, including the adoption of risky behaviors, such as alcohol and drug misuse. It's believed that individuals increase their usage of these substances as a means of self-medicating in response to the traumas that they've experienced. So if there are other traumatic events beyond ACEs, what is trauma? The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration defines trauma as having three parts: the experience that happens to the individual has to believe that it's physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and it has to have lasting negative effects throughout the individual's lifetime. The recognition The trauma can be caused by more than just personal events, which are represented in this photo by the tree, resulted in the concept of adverse community environments. We see those situations in the roots of this image. Traumas can be produced by structural violence, which prevents people and communities from meeting their basic needs. Examples are racism, poverty, poor housing. Trauma also extends beyond the individuals who are directly related to or witness or experience violence. An example of this is someone who lives in a community where a school shooting happened, but wasn't directly affected. If a large portion of the people in their community were, the way the whole community interacts can change, and that can affect the people who weren't directly involved and might not have known someone who was. Together, adverse community experiences and adverse community environments are sometimes referred to as the pair of ACEs. We now recognize that natural disasters and climate crisis can also be traumatic, as illustrated on the right-hand side of this image. There are three realms of ACEs can create traumatic events that intertwine throughout people's lives and affect the viability of families, communities, organizations, and systems. Traumas can take on different forms. There are acute traumas, which are usually one-time events like an accident, death of a loved one, weather event, or assault. Trauma can also be chronic or occurring over time, such as ongoing abuse or neglect, combat situations, or even multiple unrelated traumas. Trauma can be incredibly complex, such as repeated uprooting, homelessness, human trafficking, and living as a refugee, or experiencing more than one type of ongoing abuse or neglect. And then there are system-induced traumas, such as the removal of a child from a family and placement in foster care, sibling separation, having to testify in court against family, and living in extreme poverty. We all experience stress in our lives. If I do the same thing over and over and never change things up, I'm feeling pretty comfortable, but I'm also not learning anything. I'm in my comfort zone. In order to learn something new, I have to step outside that comfort zone, even just a little. When I can do this with a feeling of relative safety, that's positive stress. And that's where learning happens. When those boundaries get pushed even more, and I start spreading further out and feeling as though maybe this wasn't such a good idea, I get nervous, my heart starts racing, I might get blinders or tunnel vision. I feel as though things might get really messed up, and I'm not happy about being in this position. But if it's relatively short-lived, or I have a person or two to process it with after, I might realize I'm relatively okay and came through it unscathed. I might even feel as though it wasn't so bad after all, and I could try it again. That might even make me excited, because next time I might not be so nervous, because I know I had a good outcome this time. This is called tolerable stress. It's when those boundaries get pushed even further to a place where I seriously feel as though I can't handle it. There's no end in sight, or I feel as though my life might be in danger. I have no one to process this with afterwards. That's toxic stress. Toxic stress is the mechanism by which adversity becomes traumatic. Two people can experience the same thing, and it might be traumatic to one and not the other. Genetics has something to do with this, because some people have a genetic makeup that protects them from anxiety and depression. But very frequently, the difference is whether the person has a supportive adult to rely on, who can buffer the person from what would otherwise be traumatic. When your brain detects a threat, the amygdala, or survival brain, releases adrenaline, norepinephrine, glucose, and cortisol, and it revs up your body and your brain. It activates your fight, flight, or freeze response. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, or thinking part of your brain, assesses the threat and either turns up or down that response. Following trauma, studies show that the amygdala is hyperreactive and the prefrontal cortex is less activated. So that can result in the person experiencing hyperarousal, hypervigilance, and increased wakefulness and sleep disruption. In addition to changes within the brain, experiencing toxic stress can result in other physical changes to a person's body. This image shows some of these physical impacts, and I'd like to highlight that there's emerging evidence that suggests that changes to genetic markers may be passed down from generation to generation. That could be one of the causes of what we see as intergenerational trauma. Let's talk about trauma as a pathway to crime. What do I mean by that? There's an undeniable link between childhood trauma and later criminality. This is especially true for people who are convicted of drug and property offenses. We know that people who have experienced trauma are more likely to engage in risky behaviors, including the overuse of alcohol or the use of other substances, perhaps as a means of self-soothing or self-medicating. Since we've outlawed the use of many of these substances, rather than treat it as a medical concern, it is often a direct pathway to criminality. We also know that many people convicted of property crimes engage in that behavior to increase their ability to acquire illicit substances when other sources are no longer available. Now that we've introduced community, complex, and system-induced traumas, we can look at another finding of the National Survey of Children's Health. The survey includes the question, to the best of your knowledge, has your child ever been treated or judged unfairly because of his or her race or ethnic group? The results show that Black children who've experienced individual discrimination have higher rates of ACEs. This is important to note when we talk about the prison population, because a disproportionate percentage of incarcerated people identify as Black. Here you see the 2018 racial disparities in prison incarceration rates, adjusted for population. Why is this? Structural racism. We already talked about how people of color are more likely to experience adverse childhood experiences, and that community factors such as poverty, involvement in the child welfare system, and experiencing racism can be experienced as trauma. There's also a phenomenon called the school to prison pipeline that plays a role in it. Studies show that when children are disciplined at school or in the community, children with disabilities or who are of color receive harsher penalties for the same behavior as their white peers. While a white child might have his parents called for tripping another child during recess, the child of color might have to sit out or receive an in-school detention. Over time, students build up a record or reputation of having a behavior problem, and their punishments continue to escalate to include suspensions and even expulsions. As the children age, these attitudes carry over to the juvenile justice system. Children of color are more likely to be arrested by school resource officers, and more likely to receive harsher sentences. Statistics show that Black people are disproportionately stopped by police on the street and more likely to be arrested. Black youth are arrested far out of proportion to their share of all youth in the United States. Black people are disproportionately serving life without parole, or virtual life sentences. In addition to this, Black and Hispanic people are also more likely to be detained in jails before their trials because they can't pay the bail. And people who are incarcerated report high rates of childhood trauma. I want to take a moment here to talk about children who grew up with ongoing abuse or neglect or in homes with domestic violence. We know that when there's violence within the home, there's at least one family member who's experienced trauma. In families with children, the dynamic is even more complex. Parents living with unresolved trauma are often not available to fully support their children. Children who grow up with chronic abuse or neglect don't learn how to form solid attachments or understand cause and effect. This is because babies and children learn that when they cry or show a need, a parent satisfies that need. In a home without consistency, children never learn from this basic feedback loop. If a person doesn't understand the cause and effect relationship, they may not understand or be able to predict the consequences of certain actions. This can lead to them behaving and reacting to circumstances without a clear understanding of why some responses are acceptable and others are not. This can lead to behaviors that others would describe as poor choices, right up to and including criminal behaviors. In addition, parents are supposed to be purveyors of safety. So if they're not safe, how can a child feel safe in the world? To complicate matters, as they grow, children model their relationships off of what they see at home, which can lead to cyclical intergenerational trauma and choices that result in criminalized behavior. Another remarkable study of incarcerated men by the Missouri Department of Corrections reported near universal trauma in adolescence. In addition to childhood trauma, incarcerated people report high rates of trauma throughout life as compared to community rates. The sexual trauma rates here are worth noting, as frequently homeless youth have high rates of being victimized on the streets. Incarcerated females appear to have different risk factors for offending than male offenders. Incarcerated females show elevated rates of interpersonal trauma, substance dependence, and associated symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. One study showed the majority of women in jail experienced multiple types of adversity and interpersonal violence in their lives. Incarcerated females report greater incidence of mental health problems and serious mental illness than incarcerated males. Women with SMI were more likely to have experienced trauma, to be repeat offenders, and to have earlier onset of substance use and running away. The study found that victimization appears to increase the risk of experiencing mental health problems, which in turn is related to increased likelihood of criminal offending. We've talked about how experiencing trauma can affect a person's understanding of cause and effect, leading to criminal behavior, and about the link between self-medicating and criminality. Another reason for the high rates of trauma among incarcerated individuals may be because some of the symptoms of trauma can lead to behaviors that we might misinterpret as a person refusing to cooperate. These behaviors can be seen by school officials, police, and other authority figures as noncompliance, which can result in stricter penalties for minor offenses. Over time, a person can accumulate a record that might lead to longer, harsher sentences. Similarly, there's symptoms of trauma that appear from the hypervigilance or constant state of arousal that can be misinterpreted. These can be viewed as though the person is being intentionally hostile, especially when they're feeling threatened, and can have a similar impact on a person's outcomes. There are even symptoms which might be overlooked. The result from a person disengaging, feeling numb, or tuning out, since the person shows no outward signs of distress, authority figures might not suspect a history of trauma. Now that we understand trauma as a pathway to prison and its prevalence among inmates, we need to talk about the prison environment itself. There are things that can make a person who's experienced trauma feel as though it's happening again in the present reality. These are referred to as triggers. Triggers activate the fight, flight, or freeze response and limit access to the higher functions of thought because the person truly believes that their life or well-being is in danger. Common triggers include unpredictability, sensory overload, feeling vulnerable or frustrated, confrontation, or experiencing something that reminds the individual of a past traumatic event. Most, if not all of these, are commonplace in traditional correctional facilities. Common triggers in correctional facilities include constant lighting, never being able to get a good night's sleep. Imagine how that would affect your feeling of well-being and your ability to regulate your emotions and interact in a calm manner. Loud noises or doors slamming. I worked in one facility where the doors were so loud, I never got used to it. Even knowing this about the place, when the doors would close, I'd jump almost every single time. Imagine what it would be like to be someone with significant trauma who is required to live there and knows that they can't leave. A lack of privacy, especially in bathrooms. A fear of victimization. The lack of good touch. All sexual relationships are prohibited, even if they're consensual. In many facilities, there are even rules about touching visitors. In some, you can't touch at all. In others, people who are incarcerated are strictly limited to a hug or short touch upon meeting or leaving. And intrusive body searches. These are especially brutal for individuals who've experienced prior sexual victimization. A growing body of research indicates that solitary confinement, in which an inmate is held in isolation and which is used as behavior management technique in prisons, is ineffective and can have negative impacts on mental health. As we're looking at these effects, it's important to note that this is no exception to the disproportionality in punishment. Black men and women are overly represented in solitary confinement throughout the nation when compared to the total prison population. Here you can see some of the harmful psychological effects of long-term solitary confinement. It's important to note that these effects are magnified for juveniles whose brains are still developing and people with mental health issues who are estimated to make up 1/3 of all prisoners in isolation. The rates of violence in the US prisons leads to the further traumatization of inmates. Incarcerated persons may also be pressured to commit crimes while in prison. This frequently is related to smuggling or selling drugs or cell phones. They might also feel the need to join or befriend a gang for protection but this can lead to pressure to commit illegal activities. It's understandable how these experiences could exacerbate the symptoms of trauma or even be traumatic themselves. All this brings us to considering correctional design with a new mindset. We have to rethink with a trauma-informed approach. Recidivism is the likelihood of reoffending. According to the National Institute of Justice, almost 44% of the recently released return before the end of their first year out. About 68% of individuals released in 30 states in 2005 were arrested for a new crime within 3 years of their release, and 77% were arrested within 5 years, and by year 9, that number reached 83%. In 2004, 17% of the people incarcerated in state prisons and 18% of people in federal prisons said they committed their current offense to obtain money for drugs. Statistics show these are typically property and drug offenses not related to violence. We know that drug use is linked to trauma, which prisons worsen. And we know that incarceration is not an effective deterrent against future crime. So it seems we need a new approach for nonviolent and drug offenses. Restorative justice emphasizes repairing the harm caused by criminal behavior. It's best accomplished through a cooperative process that includes all stakeholders. This can lead to a transformation of people, relationships, and communities. When compared to traditional criminal justice responses, restorative justice programs show promising results of being more effective at achieving victor offender satisfaction, offender compliance with restitution, and decreased recidivism of offenders. We talked about the possible impacts of trauma. We also mentioned that just because a person experienced trauma does not mean they will experience the negative outcomes or risks associated with that trauma. Resilience is a person's ability to overcome serious hardship. And building a person's resilience is the number one way to protect against the risks associated with trauma. A person's resilience can be built up over time through consistent supportive relationships and spending time in the positive and sometimes tolerable stress zone. As opposed to prisons which amplify existing and add new traumas to people incarcerated, the practice of restorative justice work to build their resilience, which can interrupt an impact of past traumas by lowering the individual's stress response and giving their system a chance to rest. In this state, that healing can happen. So in implementing a new mindset for justice, you must work on prisons. I implore you to mitigate or eliminate as many of the triggering aspects of correctional facilities as possible. However, I urge you to think about correctional design as designing new restorative spaces, not prisons, for it's here that you can make the greatest impact. Framing correctional design as designing for restorative spaces gives you the opportunity to move past minimizing potential triggers. You can be on the forefront of a new movement for social justice and equity through the spaces that you design. In creating spaces in which healing can happen, you can be part of reducing recidivism, building resilience, and providing a previously elusive sense of physical and emotional safety. And that is the very epitome of trauma-informed design.